the reward of making other people smile and happy in a work environment is really difficult. When we think about healthcare, all the stress that our caregivers and leaders are under, you have the opportunity to do those things that just make them smile, whether it's a promotion, whether it's a 4-day work week, whether it's an innovative solution that makes their day easier. Sometimes it's a small thing, and maybe it's a thank you note. But that to me is what it's like to be unleashed and in the group.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Today, we're joined by Angelo Venditti, who is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Workforce Solutions at AMN Healthcare, based out of Dallas, Texas. We're going to be sharing today three things. One is, what are some of the trends that are changing in the labor market, and how can leaders better understand and anticipate the implications of those? Two, how do we show up as leaders when we move from being in what we call a type 1 to more of an innovative or type 2 or 3 adaptive situation? And then finally, how do we deal with some of the frustration that we inevitably experience as a leader? What are some practices that can keep us in the game long enough to get to those adaptive solutions? Angelo, great to have you on the show here. Welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. It's great to join you.
Yes, absolutely. You're really pioneering some cool things in the healthcare industry based on your not insubstantial experience, having run delivery in the past. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your current organization, what you guys are working on, and then how you joined them recently and what you're looking to do in that role?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just recently transitioned out of the hospital work where I was at Temple to AMN Healthcare in Dallas. And AMN Healthcare is a really exciting company on a great trajectory, really working around innovation, new models in the workforce space. We've seen over and over again where organizations are spending a ton of money on contingent labor, temporary labor, travel nurses. And so AMN is really at the forefront of not only supplying those needs, but helping organizations figure out how to be more efficient with their dollar in labor spend and get the right clinicians or right folks to the bedside to take care of patients in the most efficient and effective way. So it's exciting, and I'm really proud of what the organization is doing.
That's great. And it's a different role for you. Like you said, you were in direct delivery for a while, and now you're trying to help orchestrate these labor challenges across the entire healthcare system. What was appealing about this role that called to you?
I think for me, it was the broad view across the country that I get and the opportunity to work in different organizations. As you approach organizations, everyone feels they're unique or their problem is unique or their circumstance. And so with this specific role, I'm able to share with folks, I saw this happen over here, and here's a few things you can consider for your workforce. And here's the nuance based on what you're telling me of how I think it applies to you. So it's a really refreshing view. And I have to tell you, like, healthcare organizations are heavily focused on this, and they're really engaged right now. It's fun.
The value of an organization is in its people. And you also mentioned, yes, every person, every group, every organization is unique. And there are patterns that go across organizations and industries and countries. How do we weave those three things together? How do we make sure that we've got the right people at the right place at the right time? How do we make sure that we're solving for the uniqueness of those organizations? And at the same time, how do we take advantage of the larger strategic trends? And that is no small cube of feat intellectually to achieve. So great to have you here to talk more about this. So Angelo, why don't we break down the problem a little bit? Like, you experienced it directly, and now you're working on the solution, but talk a little bit about this labor challenge. And you've seen it through a hospital lens, but it's affecting every industry, just in different flavors. What is the labor challenge as you define it?
I think to drill it down into one thing and be laser focused is really difficult.
But there's probably a couple of elements there. So yeah,
you're right. I think it's the way people expect to work coming out of the pandemic is fundamentally different than before. The way people prioritize work life is different. The way they are able to earn money is different. There's just a different expectation from the worker's perspective or from the employee perspective And I think organizations are adapting to that, but probably need to be a little faster in that space. I also think there's so much opportunity right now, especially in healthcare. It's super competitive to grab an employee and retain them over the long term because they have so many options. It's like, if you're a nurse and you lose your job today, you'll have one in 2 hours. It's no longer where you have to go search. These opportunities are coming. I don't know how you feel about that. I'd be interested in your perspective as well.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of naming the key variables. I totally agree with all of those. You mentioned the workforce side of it. On the employer side, on the organizational side of it, they are trying to improve their delivery to their customers. They're trying to make sure that they do so at an affordable cost. I mean, healthcare affordability, something's like that's a challenge for everybody because we're all consumers of healthcare. So I think they're trying to be mindful of that. And also the workplace, like you said, has changed. I know we were advocating for the appropriate use of telemedicine to be able to reach more patients, reduce the friction of access to care issues, the rural communities. So you've got changing employer organization objectives with their customer centricity and challenges with affordability. You got access to care issues for the consumer. Then now there's this labor question of like, at the end of the day, it's one thing for me to hail an Uber driver, but now I need to hail a neurologist or a podiatrist or whatever, right? And you're like, not quite sure I'm comfortable doing that just yet. So how do we evolve this given that people want to work in different ways? Customers expect to receive services in different ways. To your point, you're right. That doesn't make it simpler. It just makes it that much more complicated. So what are some of the trends that you're seeing across these hospital workplaces with how we can think differently about having a meaningful place to work, a meaningful customer experience, and a meaningful and fulfilling career? That's what we're trying to solve for. That's the triple goal.
Absolutely. For the longest time, and I'll speak mainly in the nursing, but you can apply this to most of the professions and healthcare organization. For the longest time, it was longer hours, shorter days, 12-hour shifts. And there's been some literature that says, hey, 16-hour shifts aren't good. Organizations went to 12-hour shifts. Now we're seeing that perhaps 12-hour shifts are too long, and that it's contributing to burnout and all of these things that we're feeling from the mental health perspective, especially coming out of the pandemic. And so now you're seeing organizations trying to figure out, we don't want to go back to 5 8-hour shifts because people didn't like that. So what is the makeup of those opportunities? I also think that there is a greater focus from an employer standpoint on employee mental health. And so we're seeing apps come out, enhanced EAP programs, which is absolutely outstanding. And we're seeing the physical element partnered with that, where they're saying, hey, let's get out and exercise. Let's have a sponsored walk. Let's do a run club. These are all things that on the surface, we're appealing to mental health and we're appealing to being physically fit, but we're also creating a community in these organizations that people feel proud to be a part of. So I think that's some of the shift we're seeing. Of course, it's no surprise to anyone that another shift we're seeing is these hybrid roles where people are in the office a couple of days, they're working from home. And I think outside of direct clinical care, that's a really appealing model. One of the things when I was at Temple we did at the time was almost unheard of in trend setting. We moved our managers and directors to 4-day work. And people were like, well, this is a 24/7 operation. What are we going to do when they're not here on Monday and Friday? And it's like, we'll do the same thing we do on Saturday and Sunday. What we found when we did that is really nothing changed and everything was fine. And all of the dramatics around like quality is going to suffer, and it just didn't happen.
Because again, in a primary care practice situation, the physician's only there 3 days a week. That's tough. But we are a system. We are an organization. We're a company. We've got multiple people. We should be able to run 24/7 without needing the same person to be there 24/7, whether that's the CEO or that's the janitor or that's anybody in between. I can relate to your comments about nursing professionals. My mom was a nurse. My grandmother was a nurse. My sister is a nurse. Pretty much everybody in my family is a nurse except for me. I was an EMT, so I didn't quite make the cut, but I can relate a little bit. And my wife's a veterinarian. It's just the lifestyle impact and the draw on their bodies and their mental health that just wore them down over the years that I personally witnessed as they're given so much to their patients, to their colleagues. It had to change. It wasn't good. I think we lulled ourselves into thinking it was okay just because that's what it was. But while maybe we didn't like the fact that they happened, I think they've opened up the possibility that there might be more than one way to solve this that has a higher net outcome. But the transition is tough. Going from A to B, that change management is really hard.
It is a great evolution of how people work.
And when we don't necessarily need it to be hands-on, like how can we do it through the systems, through the virtuals, through the other methods if possible? And it's trying to optimize all those variables, but there isn't one right size fits all for everybody, for every situation. And it requires a little bit higher level of thinking in the way we lead and the way we solve problems. So let's shift a little bit into that. One of the questions I have across our other previous guests, we were talking about the importance of culture and how do you make places and spaces of work that are meaningful and attractive and desirable for the customers, for the workers. Can we talk a little bit about how do you do that important work when you have a contingent workforce that might be there variable times and be working at multiple different cultures at the same time?
That's a great question and so relevant for what we're seeing today. They label it the gig economy. I think organizations, leaders have to approach that every contingent resource they have in their hospital, every contingent human being is a recruitment opportunity. And when you approach it like that, it really boils down to building a relationship. And we do this all the time. We do it with neighbors. We do it at community events. We do it at marathons and runs. And we sometimes miss that opportunity because it's work to do that in an organization. And the more we can make anyone who enters our organization, patient, contingent labor, feel like they are part of something, they want to come back. And it's that drive to come back that makes them say, I want to be here. I really think, as fundamental as that sounds, I think it's just like the pin.
Yeah. And it's shifting from looking at employees as something you own versus something that you continuously recruit to create a community. I think of the airline statements like, oh, we understand you have a choice in your airlines. Thank you for choosing us today. I think if we looked at our workforces, thank you for choosing us today. That's a choice that gets renewed every day. I think that creates a more powerful and impactful relationship than, okay, get in the door. Okay, now I got you. You're mine. I can do whatever I want. And as long as it doesn't get too bad, you'll stay. I think we're ready to update that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think the get in here and get to work mentality, those days are gone. Now it's get in here, get to know us. We hope you love us. Please stay. It's a good fit.
You'll continue to choose us. And my wedding vows, we did them independently, but we both ended up saying the same thing, which was essentially, I'm not saying I will love you forever no matter what. I'm saying I will choose to love you every day. It's a new choice every day. And people were like, it sounds like you're giving yourself an out. And I'm like, no, what it's saying is that I'm purposely choosing to be in. I'm not taking that for granted. I think creating that kind of relationship between the people who deliver the work, and the people who receive the work, and the people who organize the work, that's going to create a much more powerful community.
I think that's really profound. Let people have the choice every day they walk in and create the space where they want to choose.
Wonderful. I'm glad we covered that. Angelo, let's switch gears a little bit here. I think this is useful information for leaders to be able to anticipate how the workforce dynamics are changing and start to anticipate it. But you're in a really unique role right now where you are trying to create solutions for things that have never been done before. I learned a long time ago from a gentleman by the name of Ronald Heifetz. He's at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and he introduced this notion of types of leadership challenges. So type 1 is where there's a known problem and there's an existing solution, right? And really the role of the leader there is to help them get access to the solution. Then there's a type 2 where there's a known problem, but there's not a known solution or not an existing solution. So there, the role of the leader is to help the organization innovate and come up with new solutions to those challenges. And then a type 3 is where we're not really clear what the problem is. It's complex and it's messy and it's a little bit right outside of our line of sight. And then also we don't have an existing solution for that. So there, the role of the leader is very different, where we're trying to elevate the thinking and raise the consciousness and our understanding of the scenario so that we can then be in a position to start to create solutions together. And when people expect a type 1 leader, when we're in a type 3 situation, that creates a lot of tension. As you shifted from being somebody who was deploying known solutions and known problems in a healthcare industry to now you're trying to help innovate solutions for the industry as a whole and evolve the thinking of the industry, I think there's been some interesting conversation around that. So what are the type 2 or 3 challenges that you're facing right now? And how is your leadership approach changing in regards to those?
I think one of the spaces where it's changing is the concept of virtual nursing. And as you dive deeper, it's so broad and there are so many applications, you get lost in the sauce. Do you mean post-acute? Do you mean in the hospital? Do you mean a mentorship role? Do you mean directly with patients, et cetera, et cetera? And so what I'm learning is that the answer is it depends on who you're talking to. I think the hallmark trait is nimbleness. You've got to be nimble and iterative and willing to try and willing to fail and fail fast. I also think you have to be very open to the opinion and input of others as you're going, because it takes such diversity of opinion to solve the unknown. If your leadership style is command and control and very directive, you probably ought to take a little bit of a back seat and let somebody who has the ability to bring people together in a collaborative way.
I think if I was to try to distill what you're saying, again, make it as practical as I can, there's a time and a place, like I said, a type 1 situation where the value add as a leader is getting access to the solution as fast as possible. And you're like, hey, we have a problem, boss. And you're like, all right, talk to Susan because she knows the answer. Do the answer. Did you do what Susan said? And we're done. I'm not saying you have to have the answer. I'm saying you're trying to make sure you have access to the answer. And their efficiency and decisiveness and specificity, I think, really are valuable behaviors. But then, like you're saying, you go to a type 2 and you're like, okay, we got to be nimble. We got to be curious. We got to be willing to wander a little bit. We got to be open to different perspectives. I can't ask just Susan to get the answer. I'm going to have to ask a whole bunch of people, and they're all going to be partially right and partially incomplete. And I have to have some patience for that and some tolerance for that. And I got to know that that itself is valuable versus being in haste to say, okay, let's just get to the solution. Because then we're going to short circuit the process and we're not going to solve the underlying problem. So I think that's a fundamental shift in behaviors to the decisive execution focus versus the inclusive experimentation and curiosity focus.
Totally agree. I had the opportunity at Temple to work for an outstanding CEO, Michael Young. He made decisions very quickly, and he was experienced in most of what happened he had been through before. And when there were times where he would always say to us, don't do what I say, do what I mean. That was him saying, we know what the problem is. And the solution may be one of these 4 or 5 things. And I'm telling you to go solve the problem. He would always spit the solution. Because he was a great leader, you had the opportunity to do what he meant.
There was some freedom and autonomy even in that guidance. We've seen this before. We know what the problem is. Get after it. I think part of the solution would be X. It wasn't just a wild goose chase. So there was clarity, there was focus, but there was also some freedom to breathe and interpret it. It depends on who, or it depends on, well, in this department, that solution is going to look a little differently than that department.
What I loved about that scenario, which I think is really important, is if you chose the solution and it didn't work, he was right behind you and saying like, okay, it didn't work. What's next? He kept you moving. He never let you sulk in the failure.
Yeah. The failure cost us once. Sulking cost you twice, and you're not getting any smarter. The value of the mistake happened in the first price you paid, right? Let's get the lessons learned. Let's keep moving. But when you scale that, you go beyond a hospital. Now you're looking at a hospital system. You're not talking about hundreds of different cultures and different organizations and regions. I think the need for that collaborative curiosity, experimentation, recognizing it depends on who. It depends on this hospital, this nurse, this scenario, and that the answer to that might look very different than an answer somewhere else. I think the craving is for certainty. I love how Heifetz says, like, to disappoint at a rate that they can handle. I got to get you uncomfortable enough to juggle all these variables long enough so that the good stuff can come out. But I know it's going to wear you out. And I know I can't do that forever. And so managing that pace accordingly, and they're going to get frustrated at you. So I imagine you've got customers, you've got bosses, and they're like, Angelo, what's the right answer? Why can't you just solve it for me? Give me a certainty and a clear answer. And you can't do that. So what do you do for your customers in those situations where they're looking for the short, simple silver bullet? And you're like, there's a little more to it than that.
I think it again is the knack of inquiry, so you can assimilate as many variables as possible so that you're giving the best guidance with the information you have. And that's one thing I try to be forthright is you know your organization, you know your culture and your team, and together we should come up with the solution. And here are some options we might consider, like they do on House Hunters. Let's eliminate one right away. And then go through that iterative process to land where multiple people and leaders feel comfortable in the space. Because ultimately, even if I were with a client come out of the gate and say, oh, we should do this, they have to feel comfortable executing it. And certainly you'll support them, but it's important that they have solution as much as possible.
I like the tips that you said there. Like, okay, they're coming at you. There's a humility that begins the process by recognizing I only know a very small subset. Even if I have deep expertise in this area, I only know a thimbleful of you. So bringing some humility to that and some true curiosity and compassion to understand it. That sounded like a step one. And then step two was not looking for the answer, but looking for the options. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely.
Because I think we're trained in so many educational environments that there's one right answer. It's in the teacher's head and your job is to find it. And that sets us up for a real rude awakening when the world's more complex than that. So you show up with a couple of options, then iterate through some comparisons. And maybe early on we get to eliminate one, which is clearly going to be faulty, but then we can then zero in on a permutation of a couple of the other ones. That would be the sequence that I would extract to say, if I'm in this situation, how could I be like Angelo? Have some humility, bring some options, iterate through to get to a combined version that works for their scenario. Is that a secret sauce of Angelo?
I think so. And I would add that as long as I've been in healthcare, we have stressed efficiency and elimination of waste. So leaders tend to look for the quick answer because there's a perception that if I solve this now, that's the most efficient path and the least wasteful. Therefore, I'm better off. And sometimes efficiency means going through the process enough to know what you're going to deploy is going to work. There's a balance of go forward fast, let's solution this a little bit, and then go fast.
Yeah, that's the old expression, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I think it requires an evolution of our definition of efficiency. What's most expedient and simple and fast, that's one interpretation of efficiency. But what is going to scale the organization to have an incredibly positive brand and what's going to be able to have the most qualified workforce, and that's going to allow us to do it in a sustainable fashion with our customers, that's also a definition of efficiency. And the answers to those two definitions are wildly different. Again, there's a time and a place for a type 1 efficiency should be simplest and clearest, fastest path to access the solution, 100%. But we've got to be able to declare we are not in that circumstance right now. Therefore, we need to operate with different definitions and different behaviors. How do you define the value add in that situation? I mean, I'm a big Lean Six Sig guy, and there's 8 types of waste. And the reality is you never eliminate all of them, but you are always having a trade-off. I don't even like to call it waste. I like to look at it as gold. Like we are investing our time and effort in this, but are we investing in the wisest way possible? So doing a pilot with one of our auxiliary locations for one type of service that we provide that we do for 3 months to be able to answer some key uncertainty questions that are driving our strategy. Is that a waste or is that a return on investment? I think that's the reality of it. Do you ever have days though, Angela, where you just get frustrated and tired and overwhelmed, or do you just always know how to do this naturally?
No, I think I have learned to process my frustration better. And it's through some of the things I talked about earlier, like going out for a walk. I know sometimes if you're working in a hospital or in a work setting, you can't always just go out for a walk. But I think it's finding that mental break for you so that you can start to reason in your head the reality of the situation. I'm a big fan of Cy Wakeman and reality-based leadership and getting yourself in a space where you can get back to reality about what you're dealing with. But that is a process I've learned. With that said, I am completely imperfect.
I asked it because I think folks are like, yeah, it's easy for you to say that, but my life situation is difficult and my scenarios are challenging. And I think we all need to hear leadership is frustrating. Complexity is frustrating. It's worthwhile, but it is frustrating. So could you zoom in just for a little bit, Angelo, and tell us a bit about your practice of doing that? so that you can have access to the creativity and the lateral thinking and the integrative thinking to be able to show up in a better way in those conversations. There's something I think you're doing between this year and this year. Could you give us a little insight to that for those who might be able to replicate it to help them?
You're right. I do have a process, and that is when I start my walk, I drift on to things that I'm not frustrated about. I'll listen to music. I will pull up LinkedIn, something that is a distractor. And for me, that probably lasts 2 to 5 minutes. Then I'm starting to think, what about that problem that brought me to this point? And now I'm starting to get back in the space of reality. Is it really going to cause World War III? Is it really going to make the hospital collapse? Are patients really going to die? And try to get some levity and reality in the space. And I think once you get there, then you can begin to process solution and the route you're going to take for what you think is the best fit. And sometimes the best fit is just pull in other stakeholders. I also love to call and talk to other leaders and just have this scenario. What do you think? That for me is refreshing and real, because more times than not, they'll help you bring reality, maybe sometimes quicker than you can yourself.
Yeah, that's what relationships do. They're great mirrors for us. So Angelo, that was incredibly helpful. Let me see if I can recap that a little bit. So there's a few parallel things that are happening that you're doing intentionally. It's not an accident. You're doing something physically to break your current pattern. Remove yourself from the location and you're moving your body. So you're getting some blood flowing. That gets some oxygen going to the brain. Then I hear you do something for 2 to 5 minutes that is not related to the problem at hand. That gets the neurons firing or gets them relaxed. Those are focus and physiology things that create a state of possibility for you. Then you go in and you say, okay, well, let's seek the truth. What's real about what's happening right now, and use that to gain perception. Because it might be inflation of the risk that's paralyzing my thinking. Like, let me get grounded in the reality. And that sounds like that would be limiting, but the reality is it's liberating. I can look more clearly at the possibilities and be able to see what's out there, and then be open maybe to a diverse perspective from a colleague or somebody in a different industry. If I was to recap what you shared, those were the elements I heard.
I think that's it. You mentioned in the beginning you were an EMT, and so you'll definitely relate with this. When you were under those very stressful situations, whether it be a car accident or a cardiac arrest, and then you drop them off to the hospital, and then it's like the adrenaline leaves you. And then you're like, what do I do now? And I can remember a lot of my colleagues at the time would go out and smoke a cigarette. Now exchange the cigarette with a walk.
Well, that's a heck of an upgrade there. Very nice. Angelo, thank you for taking time as you're trying to solve for these really big, complex problems that are going to benefit all of us. Thank you for sharing some of the insight that's going on in your brain and in your behaviors as a leader. We've talked about the shifting industry trends. We've talked about showing up differently based on the type of challenge you're facing. And then you gave us this wonderful gift of how do we create the space for us to be able to operate in that way mentally. Angelo, that's a great way to end our conversation today. Thank you again. How can people stay in touch with you?
Reach out on LinkedIn. I try to stay pretty active on. Otherwise, you can email me, Angelo Venditti at amnhealthcare.com. I love to meet up and just have coffee over virtual settings.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.